All right. Hey, welcome back, guys. This is Politics with Roger, Political Science 101. Thanks for joining us. This is the fourth video in our Political Science 101 series. This is the video about communication, the lesson about communication. You may recall our first video was about power and influence and authority, but basically power. The second and third video was about the political paradigm in general, the difference between the left the political paradigm and the right of the political paradigm. So the next two videos, videos 4 and 5, this video is about communication, and video number 5 is about information. Now the reason I'm laying out these videos in this order is very specific. I'm hoping that, with these, especially with these early videos that are very important, will give you a base to understand future, more advanced concepts. But when you look at communication and information and the left and right paradigm and power, influence, and authority through these filters that I'm giving you, you'll be able to look at any situation in the future and be able to see it clearly. So that is the purpose of all this. Now, communication, this is one of my favorite topics. I love political science, and I like all facets of it. But communication is its own industry. It doesn't necessarily even have to include political science, but communication is the way in political science that we organize. So it's absolutely critical. Communication, you can't separate communication from political science any more than you could separate influence and authority from power. So you would see that these terms, communication and political science and power, they also act in a continuum. So communication is just a fascinating subject to me for a lot of reasons. And I also think it's separate from the concepts of information. The reason the concept of communication is different than information, there's a few reasons, but a few that I just wanted to outline quickly for you so that we understand. Communication is present. It's what's happening right now. I'm communicating with you right now, and it will elicit some kind of response. Hopefully a good response. Hopefully it's making you think. Hopefully you're agreeing with what I'm saying. Maybe it's having the opposite effect. Who knows? But we are communicating. That is a present function. Whether you're watching this video live or, well, it's not live, but whether you're watching this video today, tomorrow, 5 years from now, when you're watching this video, we are engaging in the act of communication. It is a present function. I separate communication from information because information to me is a function of past and present. There's communication involved, but it's communicating for the future or trying to communicate what has happened in the past. So I think it's important to separate communication from information because communication is present and communication is how we organize in politics. Communication is how we organize. Information is also how we organize. But again, I would say communication is organization in the present mode. So that was the big reason I separated communication and information into two separate lessons instead of one. Looking into communication, what is it? Is it a science? Is it an art? Is it a craft? Is it a logical exercise or science? I guess, there's, how do we approach communication? Because I think this is relevant and important, particularly in political science. I think it's all these things. I do think communication is an art. And it's an art because it's not purely a logical exercise or a scientific exercise. What do I mean by that? You can give people the truth. You can give people the truth in absolute logical and scientific terms, and these truths could be rejected. They could be received as lies. They could be received as falsehoods. Why would this happen? Well, there's a lot of reasons why it would happen, but the reason it happens is because if communication was purely a logical exercise, a scientific exercise, then all one would have to do is speak logically and scientifically for their message to be received perfectly. And we all communicate with one another, so we all know that oftentimes that the message that is being transmitted, that the message being given is often not received in the way it was meant by the giver, by the one giving the communication. And these are all, and the reason it's like this is because communication is not purely a science. It's not purely a logical exercise because there's all sorts of variables in between the quality of the information and the act of delivering the information that um, basically makes it difficult to define what communicating is. So there is an art behind communicating. If you don't believe that statement, I would encourage you to listen to music that has a purpose. Listen to political music. Listen to, or you don't even have to listen to music. Watch movies that make political statements. Communication is absolutely an art. The way that we deliver these messages to one another is unlimited in its in creative scope, in possibilities. There's an infinite number of possibilities, an infinite number of creative ways to present information when communicating. So it is an art. Communicating is an art. In addition to being partially logical and partially scientific, it is an art. Is it a craft? What about building? I mean, we don't necessarily build communication with our hands, but we do create medium. We do create platforms. There's a big difference between talking on the telephone and giving a radio broadcast and giving an internet video blog. These are all different mediums. These are different modes of presentation. And one's skill in their craft does affect the effectiveness of one's communication, our ability to communicate with one another, our ability to send a message and receive the message that was intended to be sent. So, communication is just fascinating. I mean, it's an art, it's a science, it's a craft, and the possibilities are infinite in the way we deliver information. And we'll get into some of the different elements of communication. So, what are some of the elements? Well, there's the message itself. Okay. Now, what's the big deal? What is there even to talk about in the message? Well, first, let's just talk about a message. Is the message that's being given, is it true or is it false? I mean, starting right there, these are things to consider. I mean, communication isn't just about believing everything you hear, right? So one element of communication is the message. Is it true or false? Is it a lie? Now, if a message is false, is it false because somebody lied to you, or is it false because it's an accident? Is it relevant? Of course, it's relevant in communicating. So this is all part of communication. The message, is it misinformation, deception? So the message is a very important part of an element of communicating. Another element of communicating is the market, or the individual, or the receiver or receivers of the message. Do they understand the message? Does the audience care about the message? These are all things to consider in communication. And we'll dig into this quite a bit, but when we talk about marketing, when we talk about individuals, it's very simple to point out. Let's just say, for example, if you're going to sell a Coca-Cola, if you're an advertiser and you're selling Coke, the way you present the product to somebody who's, for example, an 80-year-old female, is going to be much different than the way you present the product to, say, a 15-year-old male. So in communication, obviously, the communicator, the one who is giving the message, the one who is transmitting the message or giving the message, considers who is receiving the message and how to deliver that message. That's a big part of communicating. Again, that brings us to the next element of communication, the medium or the method of delivery. A comment about that. Have you ever heard the expression sex sells? Well, what do you think they mean by that? Well, if you're going to break down that comment and what it means when they say sex sells, that is a comment referring to the presentation of whatever is being communicated. In other words, and this is fairly simple to understand. If if you're a man or a woman, it's easier to sell something to a man or woman if they enjoy looking at whatever it is that you're trying to sell them, or whatever it is that you're trying to communicate to them. Medium and the method of delivery, and this also piggybacks kind of the other element of communication that we're talking about now, also presentation. These are all elements of communication. Now, again, talking about medium, there's a big difference between sending a message from the telephone versus a text versus an email versus a video blog versus seeing a person in person, one-on-one, face-to-face. And the effectiveness of the communication is varies from one mode of medium to the next. And it depends on what the message is, in society, it's kind of a cultural taboo, I guess, or maybe it was, or maybe it is, I don't know, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess when I was growing up, I'm 39 now, it was seen as kind of low class or just in poor taste to break up with your boyfriend or girlfriend via text or via email or just, anything not in person or even on the telephone, breaking up with someone on the telephone. That was seen as not the kind of communicating that you would do. So that's an example of medium and method of delivery. There are appropriate mediums and methods of delivery for certain types of communication. And as we get into more advanced classes regarding communication, the 200 series, 300, 400 series, we'll talk more about and dive more into these different concepts and case studies. But medium, method of delivery, and then also presentation. Presentation, again, refers to that line that we all hear at sex sells. You'd rather, us guys would rather buy a Pepsi, I guess, from a beautiful woman than a giraffe. I don't know, or presentation. It makes a difference, and there's a reason. I guess I want to tell you how important presentation is, and I think you already know when to put it into words. This is where, this is kind of the core of being popular, and this is all this kind of stuff. Presentation and communication. I could have a class, not just a video, but a science all about that alone. Presentation drives so much when it comes to communication, so much when it comes to the arts, so much when it comes to business, how we put together a presentation for a sales pitch or a sales meeting or a proposal. Presentation is just a major, major concept. The whole reason we have movie stars, the whole reason we have quote-unquote celebrities is this concept of presentation within communication. So, as I go through all these concepts in these classes, they're huge concepts. And I know sometimes we go over them quick. So presentation, I just want to emphasize how important presentation is. Effective versus ineffective presentation. Is it appropriate? Is it entertaining? Is it educational? Huge elements in communicating. Again, just to recap, the messaging, the market or individual or receivers, whatever we would call them, the medium or method of delivery, very critical, and of course the presentation of the message or the communication. All very important elements. So now I just want to get into some key terms of communication, things that we'll be covering later on. This will be a little bit shorter class, I think, compared to some of the others, but just moving right through. We need to consider language. Everyone's like, yeah, no, thanks, professor. If we can't speak the same language, we can't communicate. Well, yeah, okay, well, and that really starts to show up quite a bit in history and in modern politics and in modern life. I live in the Southwest in Los Angeles, and here in the southern United States, the whole issue of language is present in our everyday lives. As most people here speak English as a first language. Many people here speak Spanish as a first language and English as a second language. And now many of us who speak English as a first language are also picking up Spanish as a second language. And I can tell you, in work situations or in social situations, things get lost in translation. More than you know. I won't even get into that now. But, language is a very important element in communication. And for those of you who know, I'm studying Spanish as a second language. And again, the words are very important. I can't I don't want to go on a longer rant, but just words are important, and it's so easy for things to get lost in language because sometimes the way we look at a word in one area, they'll look at the same word a different way. And you don't even have to speak different languages to speak different languages. As we know, in the United States, the English they speak down south with the accents and the words that they use would be different than the English they would use in New York City or Chicago, in the inner city, for example. And I think we all know what I'm getting at there. So language, a key term, a key element of communication as well. Kind of piggybacking that is someone's culture, the perspective. This kind of refers back to marketing and the examples that we used before. But again, a person's culture, a person's perspective, their filters are going to affect communication. So again, that's something very important to consider. Here's something interesting. The whole idea of logic versus truth versus fact. And again, this whole idea of truth versus fact is why communication by itself is not purely a scientific exercise. It's not purely an exercise in logic. Because if communication was simply an exercise in logic or science, we could simply speak logically, speak scientifically, and who's ever receiving the message on the other side would understand with perfect comprehension. And we all know that that doesn't happen in communicating. It doesn't matter sometimes how clearly we speak or how over the top or obvious we try to make our emotions to accompany the words we're using, messages still get lost. So why is that? A lot of times you can blame the tension between truth and fact. And just I want to read something off here that was something interesting, and everyone can look into that too. I mean, we all have different ways of looking at this tension that exists. I like this example. Truth is a generally accepted outcome or reasoning, while fact is a proven truth. In other words, every fact is true, but not all truths are facts. For example, 1 + 1 = 2 is a fact. There's only one result that's proven true when we add 1 + 1. That would have to be 2. However, if we flip it and we say 2 = 1 + 1, that may be true, but it is not a fact. And it's not a fact because there are an infinite number of possibilities that can give us I don't want to say the sum. It could give us the answer 2. 4 - 2 could give us 2. Sorry, 2 could equal 4 - 2, or 2 could equal 1 + 1.5 + 1/2. 2 does not always equal 1 + 1. So 2 = 1 + 1 is a true statement, but it's not a fact. And this is why the science of communication is constantly lost in communication because of this tension between fact and truth. But that was something very important to point out in the concepts here. Another couple of concepts I needed to point out, and this goes under the category of deception. And I need to say this about deception in communication. Deception is far more sinister and far more difficult to recognize than a lie. A lie is simply a lie, an untruth told with the intent to deceive. A deception is much more difficult because a deception could be a series of lies, or it could be a lie within a bunch of truths, which is what makes a deception so difficult, because a deception will be oftentimes hidden among many truths. Think about rat poison. Rat poison is basically 95% rat food. I'm just kind of throwing estimates. These aren't official proportions, but for the most part, rat food is probably around 95-98% good food for the rat. But the poison is only 1-2% of it, but the rat consumes all the food and in the process eats the poison. Rat poison is an example of deception. We don't just give a rat a big pile of rat poison and expect the rat to eat the poison. You put the poison hidden among good food. So that's what makes a deception so dangerous. A deception is lies hidden among truths, with the intent to deceive. So, but that's something very important to point out, because we it's today is November 3rd, 2017, and I've been saying to other political analysts and friends that we are exiting this era, what I call the age of misinformation, that started in November 22nd, 1963. Um, we have believed for the last 50 years that we have been entering into the age of information with all this new media, these new ways to communicate has been driving this age of information. But in fact, I've been saying that historians will someday agree that the age of misinformation preceded the age of information. And that's because we have been going through a great period of deception, starting with Kennedy. And I don't want to get political because this is a political science video and it's about communication, not about politics. But in the later classes, we'll cover deceptions. We'll cover what I'm talking about now. And I just want to point out that deceptions, with the advancement of media, new media, deceptions had also advanced and had become more difficult to identify and defeat, because I think most people want the truth to win, to defeat deception and lies. And new media, the internet, everything we've experienced in the last 50 years in media has been a double-edged sword, because it's a great tool to spread the truth, but it's also a very destructive tool to deceive. So we've been in an age of misinformation, not an age of information and renaissance, but that age is coming to an end. But I digress on that. Some concepts in deception, something that had come up very recently, the term gaslighting has been used a lot. You need to know what that is in modern politics. Gaslighting is basically a con game, a confidence game. It's a faux intellectualism. It's saying to somebody, questioning their sanity, questioning their sources, questioning basically, in layman's terms, it's trying to get someone to think they're crazy. Trying to get them to think they're alone in the way they think, trying to discredit their sources, discredit their way of thinking. Again, just basically trying to debase their mind into bullying them out of believing what they believe. But you see, gaslighting and bullying is a very, very prominent part of modern political discussion and communication. You see it all the time from all people. I would submit to you, I used to think at least half people in our country, in America, in 2017, really are very malleable with their views. In other words, they're very easily bullied out of their views because they don't hold strong views. So if someone that comes along with strong views comes by and starts beating somebody up on it, it's very easy in America these days to get someone to shift their point of view, because, again, because there's so much gaslighting, so much intellectual bullying, so much faux intellectualism, that people are very malleable. And know what gaslighting is. That know what cognitive dissonance is. Cognitive dissonance is basically, it's a form of hypnosis. It's when a person is forced to believe a lie as true. And a perfect example of that might, let's say there's a political event that that the government lied about. I won't even get into it. There's any number of events that we can choose from that everyone knows is a lie, but we're forced to accept it as truth. And everyone's talking about it as truth out in the street. You are living in cognitive dissonance. If someone forces you to accept a lie as truth, you are living in cognitive dissonance. If I tell you that 2 + 2 = 5, and for whatever reason, maybe, well, it doesn't matter what the reason is, you just decide for yourself, I'm going to, let Roger bully me into thinking that 2 + 2 = 5, and you go out there and carry that belief out in the world, you are living in cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance and suspended disbelief are very important concepts in communication, because many people allow themselves to live in cognitive dissonance and suspended disbelief. And that includes me too. There have been times in my life I've been totally living in cognitive dissonance and suspended disbelief. So understand these concepts in communication, because communication is not just one person gives a message and the other person receives it. There's so much in between, the message, the receiver, the medium and the method of delivery, and the presentation. and then also a person's intentions. Again, getting back to the message itself. Just a fascinating subject to discuss. Faux intellectualism. Faux intellectualism is, again, this kind of gets back to bullying. But faux intellectualism is when somebody tries to win the argument with a title or with their authority and not use any influence. For example, if I were to say something to you, let's say me and you were having a debate about gun control, and instead of arguing any of the facts or any of the current points about gun control, I say to you, you know what? I've been studying politics for 25 years, therefore anything I have to say to you is right and you're wrong. That is what we call faux intellectual. That is a faux intellectual argument. It may be true that I've been studying politics for 25 years, or somebody has been studying politics for 25 years, but just because somebody has been studying politics for 25 years doesn't mean that everything they say is true. It might give them some authority. It might give them a lot of influence, but you still have to argue each point with facts and with arguments. So faux intellectualism is something I want everyone to pay attention to. That is a tactic that's used in political communication. I want to talk to you about an Overton window, and I'm just throwing a lot of different terms that regard to communication. Overton window refers to a little bit of the receivers, the marketing, and what a political Overton window is basically the window that people see politics through. For example, back in the 60s, if you were a homosexual, it was very difficult for you to be open about your sexual orientation because the public and the society, the culture of the country, just was not in an accepting position. In other words, their Overton window had not shifted to the point where they'd be willing to accept that kind of lifestyle and at that time in culture. But as time went on and as people made arguments, the Overton window of the public shifted, and then at some point, people did become more tolerant of the homosexual lifestyle in the 80s and 90s. So you can say that the Overton window shifted from the 50s to the 90s in the issue of tolerance for the homosexual lifestyle. But Overton window refers to what the public is willing to see, what the public sees when they look through their political filters. That's what an Overton window refers to. So, that's a bunch of, and then one more concept that we talk about that's very important in communications, kind of self-explanatory, is symbols. I could flash a ton of symbols that can be very provocative now. The Nazi symbol means something to everybody right away. I mean, there's just an infinite, the cross. Symbolism cannot be underestimated in communication. I mean, even my classroom, my studio set, and the symbols that I use in my presentation. You'll see over my left shoulder, there's an upside down Hollywood sign. That all means something. There's a reason it's upside down, and that's a mode of communication. So symbolism is very important. I know it's kind of self-explanatory, but if we're going to have a discussion about communication, we need to talk about these terms. And just finally, the last thing I just want to point to, just a couple books just to look at, more about communication, some of the terms we're talking about. I'll try to rip through these fast. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. This book, I think, kind of reflects what we were talking about in regards to cognitive dissonance, deception, and it really refers to, Brave New World was an interesting book because while communism and Marxism and Mao and Stalin and the communist armies were, marching over Asia, the issue of communication, mass cognitive dissonance really became, it became a real thing, mobilizing masses of people, for example, to murder other people. What kind of messaging was required? What were people thinking? What messages were being given? And, in any instance, when you convince one large group of people to murder another large group of people, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance involved. There's a lot of deception involved. But anyway, read Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Great book that demonstrates some of those principles, just allegories for that. George Orwell's Animal Farm, another example. Can't really see the reflection there. There we go. George Orwell's Animal Farm. Excellent book about cognitive dissonance, deception, and the raw exercise of power and authority through language, through communication. A couple other books. This is just about marketing, but a book that I think, Words at Work by Frank Luntz, a political analyst. They went through a thing where they went through focus groups, just focusing on certain words that people would respond to. And while that range has disappeared a little bit, language is important. Perspective is important. Your market is important. The individual you're speaking with is important. The words you use are important. Again, this is why communicating is an art, not just a science, because different words get different results, even though they have different logical meanings. Fascinating, huh? And finally, this book I really enjoyed a lot, The New Thought Police. This kind of talks about the bullying, again, we're talking about. It's by Tammy Bruce. This book's getting old now, 15, 20 years. But you see it all over in modern politics. We're bullying people out of their beliefs. And the other book I had was 1984, but hey, I need my book back, Jerry. 1984, another book about cognitive dissonance, bullying people out of their beliefs. The raw exercise of authority and power through faux intellectualism, deception. Communication is just a fascinating topic, ladies and gentlemen. I thought this was going to be a short class. It became the longest. It's very, very important to consider all these concepts moving forward, and then we'll scratch on information in the next class. But communication, it's how we organize in politics. It is the mode of mobilization in politics. Because even if you're holding a gun to somebody's head, you're communicating something, aren't you? Well, thank you very much for participating, joining in, and we'll see you guys in video number 5, information. God bless.